Winston Churchill, yay or nay, is exactly a kind of left-right argument, right? Is he the guy who stood up to the Nazis in Britain's finest hour, the darkest hour when we were all alone? Or is he the guy who's deeply complicit in the Bengal famine and is a symbol of, Britain's colonial adventurism and disregard of other peoples? And the truth, of course, is that he's both. I think genius is fundamentally a right-wing term because it's about individuals, and often it is used for right-wing ends too. So in the example of kind of Silicon Valley, AI being the most obvious one, right? These are just genius companies led by genius men, and they should be allowed to do what they want. And if regulations and tax are holding them back, then those must be kind of blasted through, because otherwise we won't get to the future of humanity. Although Silicon Valley is often told as the story of these kind of great individual innovators, it's also a story of bucket loads of US taxpayer cash underneath it all.
Helen Lewis, hello.
Hello.
Welcome to the PoliticsJOE studio. Very glad to have you here.
Thank you very much. I'm checking out your books. I was trying to see whether or not I could sneak several copies of my book in before I leave for next time.
Yes, you absolutely can. You essentially sort of penguin bombard us, and we sort of...
I was going to say, be honest, how many of these have you read?
Not
all of them.
Not all of them. I mean, some of them actually, I can't... There's some behind you are actually wooden. Some are fake.
Okay.
One's like a stash box. You see those ones over there in that corner? The ones that look suspiciously shiny.
Okay.
You can flip the top book off, and it's, yeah. If anyone wants to stash something in this studio.
If your guests are like low energy, you can
exactly.
Give them a little...
Pep them up a little bit. Yeah, here's some Class A's.
Yeah.
Welcome. We're talking about The Genius Myth, your book.
Yeah.
Amazing. Tell me about it. Why did you want to write it? Why now? What is it about this cultural moment that perhaps means it fits in?
Well, I'd be interested in how you think about this, because some people say we're living in a really big age of debunking, right? We don't believe in the great man theory of history. We don't, idolize people. All we're obsessed is with tearing down people. And I'm not sure that's actually true. I think that impulse definitely exists, and we've seen a couple of versions of it. But I think it's a kind of eternal human drive to sort of idolize people. We just want to have people who are bigger and more exciting and kind of legendary. And that's how I kind of came to the book, right? Was the idea of that we just use this word genius really casually. I was thinking about the fact that when my iPhone screen broke, I went to the Genius bar to have it repaired. And I was like, this is overstating the level of what is the excitement that is happening when I pay money to have my iPhone screen repaired. And so I just thought this is really interesting. It's like, I really like those books that are... put it this way, I really hate those books that I think are one idea that they just bore on at you for 300 pages because that's the way to market that idea. So I thought, sorry, as I gleefully slag off 50% of books that are currently on shelves. But you know what I mean? Like, I wanted to write a book that I just could take it in lots of different directions. So it's a very big book. Some people may find that alarming, but I get to do a bit of history. I get to do some politics. I get to do some sociology, really, although that makes it sound quite dreary. But I just get to write. This is a book that can take you from Leonardo da Vinci to Elon Musk.
Yeah.
It's quite a broad span of human experience,
with a detour through romanticism. It's a whirlwind. I guess I was thinking then about great man theory, sort of these totemic figures. Churchill is the obvious British political one you go to, and sort of his mythologized status, and also the sort of the myth making that he himself did about the Second World War. And I'm sort of the place and power of myth in British politics is something that does interest me. And then I was sort of trying to turn that analysis to kind of the capitalist moment we find ourselves in. And you're right, because there are, whether it's the obvious ones, Steve Jobs, Bill Gates, Elon Musk, there are these people that, I guess, with fewer sort of Central European tribal dynasties to conquer, they instead sort of
the decline of the Habsburgs.
Exactly,
and
instead just build sort of billion-dollar empires, dominions that they can preside over instead.
Churchill is a really good example of somebody, right? Because I talk a bit in the book about the idea that genius is always a kind of political argument, and that's exactly where Winston Churchill, yay or nay, is exactly a kind of left-right argument, right? Is he the guy who stood up to the Nazis in Britain's finest hour, the darkest hour when we were all alone? Or is he the guy who's deeply complicit in the Bengal famine and is a symbol of, Britain's colonial adventurism and disregard of other peoples? And the truth, of course, is that he's both. But which one you pick is a way of signaling your politics. You know, if someone says to me, "Oh, I absolutely love Winston Churchill," I've actually got a poster of Winston Churchill. I can make a pretty good guess at the other kind of posters that they've probably got a Margaret Thatcher poster. You know what I mean? You can. It's a way of kind of saying who you are and
Yeah.
what you value in relation to it, rather than obviously poor old historians keep popping up going, "It's actually very complicated."
Yeah.
But no one really. That's not a kind of culture war slogan that anyone can get on board with,
No,
really.
absolutely. Yeah, it's less volatile. I mean, I was even thinking uh, when he gives that speech, I think it's on top of the Ministry of Health when he says, when he starts using the language of like standing alone and the darkest hour, and contrasting that with his address to the Commons when he's using the language of empire because he is speaking to
Mm.
the empire in that moment, and you can trace so much back of the way that British people conceive of the Second World War, standing alone. Okay, well, there are actually quite a few like Polish fighter pilots that were fighting in the Battle of Britain. Do you know what I mean? It's like from that moment when he leaves the Commons, goes and stands and addresses the British public, all of a sudden, it's almost like the foundation moment where the myth starts. Let's talk about your book. I want to you open up and you start by saying that the word genius, the idea of it just makes you a bit uncomfortable.
Yeah. I think because of it, well, not least because so many people declare themselves a genius, which always it's a bit like talking about yourself in the third person. It's always a bad
Do
sign.
you have to be a genius to write a book about genius?
Good, that's not for me to say. No, but you have. The thing about it is,
Possibly comment.
but you have to be kind of ambitious in a way that is not, I think, encouraged for women. I think that's the bit which I
Mm.
did feel going into this is that I was going to be being quite rude or at least brisk about quite a lot of beloved heroes of culture. And I thought some people are really going to not like this. So it wasn't, it was definitely an ambitious project in that sense. I knew I was going to kind of take some knocks for it. But I also think the problem with it is that, I was thinking this morning on the way here, who is the greatest mathematician working in the world today? By agreement of almost everybody in that field, it's a guy called Terence Tao, who is just, if you talk to mathematicians, they're like, I don't understand how his brain exists. Like he is just, it's like he's an alien to even to people who are super, super smart. But you don't hear a great deal about him, right? You hear rather more about Elon Musk, who maybe people go, I met him and he's like an alien, but often not in a particularly complimentary way. And so there's this, the other example I have in the book is Tim Berners-Lee, who, was really credited as developing the World Wide Web, the thing that the internet is built on. But he never played the genius in public. And so I think there's often a gap between people's very real achievements and their public estimation.
Mm.
And that's been the gap that lots of people have fallen down. It's the gap that, so I write in the book about a guy called Francis Galton, who was a 19th century polymath, half cousin of Charles Darwin. And he wrote a book called Hereditary Genius, in which he aimed to catalogue and rank by letters how smart and good and, how rare achievement was in a population. And one of the ways that he decided who's the best, he was like, what is the scientific way of working out who is the best, is he looked at how many inches their obituaries had got in the Times. And you just think undeniably, this guy was absolutely brilliant. But you think, okay, yes, if only there's like an objective, like a recording of all achievement, it's a newspaper in 1860. That's it. That's the final. No one will ever go back on any of this. We definitely won't miss anyone. And so that's my problem with it, is that, it's not an objective label. And so it's always a series of myths and legends. And I think what's really interesting is then working out what are those myths? Why do they appeal to us? And why do we apply them?
Mm. What do you understand the biggest ones to be, and also myths, that is, and why context matters? I wonder, is it Senius? Is that?
So yeah, that's Brian Eno's word for the idea of like a kind of cool place to be, which again I think is a really appealing concept, but but for some reason just does not catch on because it's harder to write about.
Mm.
So I think about that. So maybe like Liverpool in the 1960s with all the kind of Merseybeat bands. I've been doing I went to do Start the Week with someone who's written a book on Tupac Shakur, and that obviously he grew up in the West Coast rap scene when he moved over from the East Coast. But those songs are about LA. They're in like dialogue with lots of other rappers from that same time. You might think about like Vienna at the turn of the century, which is just a really cool place to be. And then the only one really I think that people think about now is Silicon Valley.
Mm.
Although as many people hate Silicon Valley as kind of love it. But there are places that are cool. I don't know if have you ever worked in an office where you just felt like something exciting was happening, like you
Yes.
were at the absolute center
Yes.
of the eye of the storm,
Hmm.
and that's just a very cool feeling.
I was thinking within a journalistic context, I was thinking sort of like NME in the 90s, that newsroom, and those obviously, like, we're not talking this is sort of like journalists that went on to do interesting things. I'm not sort of
Yeah.
people that like changed the world, or like the founding staff of Vice and their various disparate paths you can go on. They've really been sort of people of consequence or note.
Yeah, there's places you would have liked to have been. The day that, the button was pushed to publish some stories must have been very, very cool. My husband was at The Guardian for some of their really big stuff like WikiLeaks and Snowden. And it just must have been because there were lots of really great reporters who were all working together doing a story that really, really mattered. And I think that's the thing that we don't really have a particularly good vocabulary for talking about,
mm,
that some places are more exciting because lots of people are kind of colliding with each other in exciting ways. There's a brilliant research paper about the effect of prohibition, when drinking was banned in America in the 20s, about the effect that it had on the number of patents that got filed. And sure enough, dry counties had fewer patents. And the thesis behind that is that if people didn't go to the bar, that deprived them of a really good place to hang out and just chat about stuff and be creative. And this is one of the things I think is really sad for younger people now. When you read about Picasso's life, he was living in an absolutely scuzzy district of Paris in a leaky old warehouse. And that's the story of so many young artists and bands, particularly. Where does that happen now in our cities? There are almost none of the big major world cities where you have an artist district. You have a rundown place where all of, there are cheap rents and you live in a slightly scuzzy swat. It just can't, it feels very odd to be nostalgic essentially for the world of like the young ones where they're like, but that was a huge driver of creativity, was people who could live in places and all go to the same cafe.
mm.
And in London now, you can't do that. In Paris now, you can't do that. Certainly in California, you have to be very, the average house price in some of those Californian counties is well over $1 million.
Yeah, it's like, and anywhere that does have that sort of, it's cheaper, the artists move in, they make it cool. They're followed.
Yeah.
They're followed by private property developers who then, convert the warehouses into HMO buildings and sort of sell them for a grand
Right,
room
like
or
someone like
something.
Margate as
Yeah.
an example of that. Oh no, well, thank you for making it cool. This is
Yeah.
really thank you for done us a real solid here.
But I think you're absolutely right though about kind of, yes, you can make, whether it's intoxication, you go, okay, is Hendrix without narcotics? Is Led Zeppelin without John Bonham off his head on heroin? Does that happen? I also think then about sort of idle contemplation.
Is that your thesis? That you get concentrations of genius around really good drug deals?
Yeah, basically,
that's who I should have written a book
either
about.
like high grade smack or boredom, because you think that like Eureka, right? Archimedes in the bath, or Isaac Newton under the tree and is struck on the head by the apple. It reminds me of this time. Bit of a tangent. Sorry, you're gonna have to listen to this. When I was a kid, where me and my mate from the school bus arranged to meet in town on the Saturday at midday, and it transpired, didn't have any credit on his phone and couldn't make it. But he didn't tell me that. So I went into town and stood outside the McDonald's for 45 minutes.
And that's how I painted the Mona Lisa.
Yeah, and then, yes, and now my work is in the Louvre. No,
yeah.
I came up with the idea for PoliticsJOE. No, I got bored and I just thought about all sorts of random things. But now, because we are all surrounded by, we have the in sum total of human knowledge in our pockets, that those moments of idle contemplation, of thought, of creativity are increasingly less frequent.
Oh, I've been thinking about this a lot. And that book, Jan Laney's book about, this is the argument for deleting your social media. I think I would keep Instagram because it's pure and joyful, but I think there's like no, it is really. It's pictures of mountains and and attractive people doing yoga. That's what my algorithm forces.
Yeah, I have a few of those, but otherwise I think our feed's maybe a little bit different. Yeah,
right. But whereas the kind of text-based stuff, and particularly like really being an aggressive news consumer, I think can often end up you can end up feeling quite. And I think dried out, and also the compulsion as well to constantly be in broadcast mode. I think you're right. Like I'm old enough to be nostalgic for a time when I felt that I was bored. And I remember the first time I got an iPhone and I thought, I'll never be bored again, naively, extremely naively. But there is no boredom equivalent to the fact
Yeah.
when you've got one thing on TV, another thing on your screen, and like all of it. I just feel like a sort of Roman emperor. I'm like, this displeases us. Bring me another reel.
Yeah, please, next one.
But you're
Somebody
right. Like
else. Dance.
I think I write in the book about that, the Peter Jackson's brilliant film about the Beatles Get Back. And there's just a great bit which he holds for an incredibly long time, to the extent it's quite boring watching them in the studio noodling around on their guitars. And you begin to see how important it was. You get this collision of people in the same place. So if somebody has a really good idea, then someone goes, that was good, do that again. But also they're okay with just, maybe this morning all we do is just sit and chat and have a joke, and at some point I play something and maybe something will come out of it, maybe something won't. And I think that's really important for understanding creativity. It also shows you why it gets harder for bands, why they have difficult second album syndrome, because you wrote you wrote the first album out of kind of fun and things you had to say, and then suddenly your record label's like, the next one is due in
Mm.
6 months. And it's like, now be creative on command. And people find that just completely impossible.
Yes. Yeah. Okay, so if we were to try and apply sort of a political dimension, axis, left, right, to the idea of genius, what is the political baggage of the term? What is the politics you would possibly attach to it?
Well, I think genius is fundamentally a right-wing term because it's about individuals, and often it is used for right-wing ends too. So in the example of kind of Silicon Valley, AI being the most obvious one, right? These are just genius companies led by genius men, and they should be allowed to do what they want. And if regulations and tax are holding them back, then those must be kind of blasted through, because otherwise we won't get to the future of humanity.
Mm.
And there's, which is a kind of essentially kind of Ayn Randian, idea of just like, you have to liberate the forces of kind of great people who are having these brilliant ideas, and they can't be held back by bureaucrats. And the funny thing is, we're talking about this, they just brought out on Netflix, I haven't watched it yet, the drama about the Titan submersible disaster.
Mm.
And I just think for every time you let somebody blitz through all the regulations and rules and you get something good out of it, you do also probably get a Titan submersible disaster when some guy goes, safety testing, I don't know her. And then but it turns out that those rules are there for a reason. It is
Mm-mm.
objectively quite good that we do make people pay tax, that we don't live in this state where everybody just kind of scraps for themselves. It's also a lie, right? Because actually, if you look at someone like Musk, the cars are supported by carbon credits. That's how Tesla operates. He couldn't have, SpaceX could not have survived without NASA contracts, and that is income that is regular and big and investment guaranteed enough because it comes from the tax base
Mm.
of the US. It doesn't come from private investment. So I find that these stories are often partial and exaggerated for political ends.
Yeah. Without the Obama administration bailing him out as well, he would have been a bit of a hole. And I know I've listened to a lot of kind of people with liberal politics talk about Musk as actually he is kind of the sort of like the definition of the Mariana Mazzucato like
Mm.
combination of entrepreneur and state intervention to produce something that is quite extraordinary because of subsidy, because of loans, etc. And that could Tesla, could SpaceX exist without the US government? Almost certainly not.
But also, could he operate in Mogadishu or somewhere that really has severe problems with the rule of law? He couldn't install Tesla charging stations in somewhere where there wasn't a huge social infrastructure that means that those don't get smashed up and vandalized or stripped and sold for parts, right? He's relying on all of this. Is with Elizabeth Warren, who's now a senator for Massachusetts, when she ran the Consumer Protection Bureau, she made this speech that was that people said you didn't build this, and they said it was terrible and anti-American. But she said you didn't build this all by yourself. You took your goods to market on roads that we all paid for, which again it speaks to what Mariana Mazzucato was talking about, the fact that most of the components from the iPhone,
Mm.
a lot of them come from DARPA, a lot of them come from military research. And that's one of the reasons that Silicon Valley is in California, because there was a huge amount, not only was there Stanford, the university, but there was DARPA, there was a huge amount of research, defense research money happening in there. And guess what? That is, the army, and the US Army, which spends trillions, is a huge consumer of all the kind of cool gadgets you might make, and also has a huge interest in cool gadgets being developed.
Mhm.
So there's definitely part of, although Silicon Valley is often told as the story of these kind of great individual innovators, it's also a story of bucket loads of US taxpayer cash underneath it all.
Yeah. The book features a lot of overlooked women.
Yeah.
W- Why do you think the people that you feature haven't necessarily perhaps been reclaimed or sort of resurrected or revisited in the way that some male figures have been?
Quite a few of them have been, and this is again what I mean about most geniuses being a political argument. So the second wave of feminism from the 70s onwards had a huge historical project, which was basically forgotten history, her story, which I think we probably feel is a bit cringe as a term now, but like it came from a very good place of saying, actually, you know what, the Times obituary section is not the final judgment on humanity. Maybe there's some people we didn't run obituaries of.
Oh, really?
And so there has been this huge feminist project of saying, you know, for example, one of the big ones they would say is, you know, Jane Austen is often presented as if there were, you know, there were no novelists and then Jane Austen came along. And actually what's really, you know, fun and interesting to do if you are a nerd of this kind of thing, which I am, is to look at Frances Burney or, you know, people like that, the precursors to Maria Edgeworth, you know, to look at this whole tradition of writing that she came from. Because guess what? A lot of those novels are also quite good. And if you like Jane Austen, you'll like those ones too. But, you know, the novel is really interesting to me because it's an example of something that happens all the time, which is that things associated with women are seen as silly and frivolous. And it's, you know, I find it good and vengeful that the novel triumphed. So basically, if you were in the 18th century, all the cool guys, your Alexander Popes, were writing epic poetry, right? That poetry was the high status thing to write, which because it was men. And novels, although incredibly popular novels by Samuel Richardson, Henry Fielding. You know, the majority of the actual novels that are published in the 18th century are written by women, but they're kind of like, oh, they're just so domestic. You know, they're not really like, yeah. But yeah, guess what? You don't read a lot of epic poetry these days, do you? Actually, a bit on Instagram maybe, but that's about it.
That's the sort of the last remaining pure part of my Instagram feed is an occasional poem, but probably not necessarily an epic, you know.
No, it's probably not. I wouldn't say based on the Instagram poetry I see, it's not probably got a rigid attention to meter and Petrarchan rhyme schemes.
No, not quite.
It's more sort of I looked at a sunset.
Have you no, tell me about how genius myths can kind of excuse the bad behavior of certain men. How do the two things connect?
Yeah, I have a chapter which was a really difficult one to write because it's about people who are still alive, but it's essentially about a theatre director who was very avant-garde. All his work was kind of explicitly queer, and he had a troupe of younger men who were his company that he directed, and people felt really a little bit uncomfortable about it at the time, but kind of pressed it back. Both for the reasons that they didn't want to seem kind of Mary Whitehouse-ish and disapproving and homophobic, but also a bit because they just saw him as this great Byronic genius. You know, he was tortured. He would just produce these pages. And one of the really sad things is that he was found with child abuse images on his computer and he killed himself. And afterwards, quite bravely, a lot of people who'd worked with him wrote a series of articles saying, you know what, we should have been more questioning of ourselves. You know, we're on the left, so we think we don't believe in this great man theory. You know, we don't believe in these idolization that some men should just be allowed to do whatever they want. But we got suckered in and we were just, you know, and we didn't question ourselves. And to me, that was I thought that was a very powerful thing for them to do, and I really credit them for that because everyone would like to think that they're above this. This is something that other people idolize stuff, but I'm sure, you know, it happens all the time, and it happens to people who would say objectively that they would never fall for it. You know, Harvey Weinstein is another really interesting example, the film producer. There are jokes about him in 30 Rock, you know, the sitcom, Tina Fey's sitcom, about him being a predator in the 2000s. It was just like not an unknown thing that he was a sleazebag. But people kept working with him nonetheless. And there are two things I think happened there. One is a group of people who just didn't care about it and thought about the money. And another group of people who thought, well, actually, you know, Miramax are funding stuff that we can't get funded anywhere else. You know, he's actually kind of doing independent films and giving a chance to stuff. And so I think there wasn't just kind of cruel mercantilism that people overlooked it. It was also people who would see themselves as good people decided not to look into stuff or just to dismiss it or just to say, oh, the casting couch, the actress are getting something out of it too, because they wanted to make the kind of stuff that they wanted to make.
Mm.
And one of the things I hope people take away from it is that if you feel that something is wrong and that you're in the circle of somebody and their reputation is kind of, everybody is just enthralled to that, it's okay to walk away from it, and it's okay to speak up. You will probably get quite a bit of hatred because no one likes their idol being torn down. But ultimately, if you have those red flags, don't put them aside because everyone else adores someone. To give you another example, one of the less good bits of my career, the New Statesman, we had a guest edit by Russell Brand, and he was just an intensely charismatic figure. Just one of those people who walks into the room and demands everyone to look at them. And it is a form of narcissism, obviously. And in retrospect, absolutely, I should have been more on the alert to the fact that there were already stories about him being quite bratty at that point. Didn't know the full extent that, of that, the accusations that have now been made about him. But it was one of those things that, oh, he's a comedy genius. And I think somebody, like some of the stand-ups who spoke out against him, I think that was an incredibly brave thing of them to do because no one wanted to rock the boat. And there's almost being a whistleblower is a really tough gig, actually. No, you almost never get any thanks for it whatsoever.
Mm.
But I think that was a time in which actually, had I not been so overwhelmed by someone's kind of aura and the fact that this was supposed to be exciting and celebrity, and he was kind of otherworldly and charismatic, I think everyone might have gone, actually, a bit weird.
Yeah. Yeah, I remember watching the Paxton interview and kind of being like, I was gonna say, like, wowed,
Yeah,
yeah, like a bit like watching. And I remember and reading Exiting the Vampire Castle, and
yeah.
being like, yeah, do you know what? I kind of agree with you. And then
That's Mark Fisher's essay, isn't it?
yeah, it is, yeah.
About kind of left wing.
Scolds and like
Yeah.
he well, look, he holds up brand and is like, the people that talk down to him can't stand to see like a working class autodidact, communicating his ideas, and the sort of the puritanical, because he says some things about women or whatever, we shouldn't look past that. And obviously history does not view that too favorably, but nonetheless, I found I think we're getting off topic, but the analysis that kind of, I think he was ahead of his time in sort of seeing how identity politics would fracture and split like a typical class-based leftist analysis of the issues that Britain faces.
Yeah, I think that's another really good example about the people who, again, they just saw it as a mark of themselves that they weren't snobbish, that therefore they liked him. And this is what I think is always the interesting thing, is when you're arguing for somebody being a genius, particularly when you're arguing for someone's bad behavior to be overlooked, what's the identity character of your opponent that you're trying not to be? Do you think that they're boring old moralistic scolds? Do you think that they're, oh, feminists, they moan about everything? Do you think it's, um, DEI, like whatever it might be, and just put that aside and try and look at the actual behavior itself. And yeah, I think it's really tempting. It's also very one of the things I write about in the early part of the book is all the kind of great scientists of IQ. They were having these arguments at the time that people were fighting to hold on to grammar schools against the comprehensive revolution. And so they became swept up in the ideas of actually debunking them was a way of debunking their policy prescriptions. And you definitely see a lot of that. You see a lot of people don't necessarily want to argue the political dimension. So actually, wouldn't it be better if we just destroy the messenger? And so people end up becoming these kind of symbols of something bigger than themselves. So, if there's somebody who's advocating for universal basic income, you can have quite technical discussions about whether or not that works. Or you can find the guy who's advocating for it, and find something that is wrong with them and constantly bring that up.
Mm.
There are always these other kind of arguments going on.
You draw a line from Edison to Musk. What do you think that lineage tells us about how we mythologize inventors today?
Thomas Edison is really interesting to me because he's an undoubtedly really interesting inventor, but he's also benefits hugely from seniors. So he has this lab in Menlo Park in New Jersey, which is right at the end of a train line from New York. So everybody can kind of pop down, like all journalists can pop down and kind of see him at work. And he gets mythologized for that reason. He also implies a whole load of really great assistants around him who are incredibly technically skilled. He has Nikola Tesla over at one point, but they fall out over a bet that goes wrong. But he's just he creates a kind of magnet that draws in talented people, which is just incredibly important to everything that he wanted to do. But his mythology was that he was the American Prometheus, right? Which I think is such an interesting phrase. So Prometheus in Greek mythology steals fire from the gods and gives it to humanity, and then is tortured forever after. I think he has his liver pecked out every day, and then it regrows.
Yeah.
And yeah, one of those kind of like what's sick that came up with this. Okay. But yeah, but this was the idea that he was stealing fire, right? And he was an argument for America. Like the American part is really important about that. That America was the dynamic, exciting, forward-looking. Europe was kind of fusty and old, and where you had the great, the old masters. America was shiny and new. And I think Elon Musk is still that argument today. He's still the argument for America, particularly I think at a time when America has just woken up to the fact that very exciting things are happening in China, in the sense of it's a place that cities get built in like 5 years, and there are trains that go through buildings and whatever it might be. And, you get sort of TikTok influencers who go over there and kind of come back and go, guys, this is a bit more exciting than Iowa. But so Elon Musk is the kind of argument that no, actually, Americans are still the kind of, they're the ones who are going to have reusable rockets. They're the ones who are going to go to Mars. And I was just reading this thing, which was like, it would be objectively really good to go to Mars and we should try and do it. But ultimately, it won't be much use going to Mars at great expense and having to put in loads of infrastructure later to live there if we've destroyed this planet. Rather than making Mars habitable, probably we should just make sure we make this planet habitable first. But it's more exciting, isn't it? It's the future. And he's part of that argument that America is the future.
Yeah, but I kind of, I would, all of the kind of the phallic imagery and the Bezos versus Musk versus whoever contest of it, I would kind of, previously I sort of, all right, maybe he talks about it a lot and he really wants to occupy Mars. Maybe I do, that does feel like it's pushing the frontiers of humanity. And then when they had their big row recently, and he immediately was like, "We're going to decommission whatever the fuck it was.
I'm taking my bat ball home.
Yeah, well, I'm leaving. I'm okay. I'm not going to get my subsidies anymore. While I'm taking the train set. And it's like, I'm decommissioning Dragon, and what the fuck is? I don't know what Dragon is. Oh, right, okay, and that's so maybe now the International Space Station is no longer going to be operational because he fell out with Donald Trump, and he called him a pedo, and Trump was like talking about his ketamine, like what? Black eyes, and you go, and all of a sudden I thought, do you know what? Actually, maybe this isn't about pushing the boundaries of human civilization, and maybe it is just a status game for the billionaires who don't have much more to do with their billions and billions and billions of dollars.
Right, but it's a bit like the difference between actors and movie stars, right? There are lots of people who are incredibly good actors. Like Gary Oldman is an incredibly good actor. But would you necessarily recognize him walking down the street? Probably not, because not least he's bloody good at like changing how he looks. But you know what I mean? He can defamiliarize himself. Whereas Brad Pitt, I bet you would always see him. And William Goldman, who the brilliant screenwriter, The Princess Bride and other things, talked about the fact that no one becomes a star like that by accident. They have to want it. They have to have, and often this is often why it's kind of slightly broken people end up in that, because there's some bit of love that they didn't get, and they get it, the love from the audience compensates it. That's the kind of warm bath that's where they feel happy and secure. And I think there's a version of that with these people who get anointed as geniuses. They want to play a public role, or they find one that is comfortable for them, and they don't mind becoming a sort of symbol of something. I mean, Mark Zuckerberg is an interesting example of that, because he's somebody you can just see in the last couple of years has made a real effort to recalibrate what the public image like. You can sort of see the cogs moving. He's like, but gone is the dweeb from The Social Network, and in his new gold chain, Brazilian jiu-jitsu, Mark Zuckerberg. And yeah, maybe that is more authentically him than the previous version. But I think it also highlights that the previous version left out a lot of stuff too, right? All the way through The Social Network, he's depicted as this kind of loser who can't get a girlfriend, whereas the real Zuckerberg just had a girlfriend who is now his wife, the mother of his 3 children. Like, he's just not a man who has struggled in romantic relationships. But the genius myth of him in that film is he can't hold on to his friends, he can't find a woman, so he has to invent Facebook. And that's the way those stories do. I have a whole chapter that's about biopics. That's not one of the ones I talk about, but they do often follow that. There's something missing in your life, and instead of getting that thing, you get some version of it. There's a kind of bittersweet quality to lots of those. You have greatness, but it really comes at a price. The story of Alan Turing is a very good example of that. It's like he's amazing with computers because he isn't amazing with people. There's that story just feels so neat, I think, to people.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. I liked Zuckerberg when he was kind of wakeboarding with a full face of like Factor 50. I quite like that one.
Well, I thought that was more relatable, because that was kind of like, you know what?
That's me. That's me.
Yeah, right. Okay. Mostly, yes. I thought I too put on. Yeah, I burn into a crisp at the sight of sun. I'm not an outside child. I would always have rather been inside reading when I was a kid.
Yeah, I saw. Other than the billions and the enormous, like controlling a mega corporation, I saw a small part of myself.
Yeah, but
in him in that
easy.
photo.
All you need is the chain, you need the sunglasses, you need to grow out the hair and curl into the perm, and you need to get heavily into Brazilian jiu-jitsu.
And you're there. Last question then, and a deep one, I guess. What do you think is lost when we treat creativity and intelligence as these sort of rare, magical gifts and not shared traits of human existence?
I think one of the nicest things is making something brilliant with people that you think are also brilliant. I'm not going to say people that you like, because that's too much to ask. And often if you like them at the start of the process, you might not like them at the end of the process. But I don't know how you felt in your career, but I have always felt happiest when I have been around people that I just think, God, you're good at this.
Mm.
This is great. Like, this is beyond me, but I'd like to get there. Like, that to me is much better than the idea of being sitting solo on my mountaintop thinking, oh, aren't I brilliant? Like, let me issue another kind of tablet of stone to the little people below. And I think people are really missing out on the idea that working together with other people and valuing them rather than being kind of selfish is itself just a really deeply enriching experience. That's me at mine, usually sincere. But you know what I like? So my main job is my day job is I'm staff writer at The Atlantic. Jeff, my editor, Jeff Goldberg, when he did that Signalgate story and he got accidentally added to the group chat, apart from just being very, very funny, like, who is the last person you want to add to this? Oh, no, that literally the worst person you could have done this to. But I also just thought, you know what? He's also going to publish this story and I know he's going to do it. And he wrote it in a really funny way, which I think is also, just a courageous thing to do, not to write it in this kind of very sober stuff, but to be like, guys, this happened in a way that just felt very real. And so that's what I mean. I really like working there for that reason. I just think these people are all really smart and we're all doing the same thing. And we have a sense of, The Atlantic's supposed to be the magazine of the American idea. And they believe rather unfashionably that America should be a functioning democracy with the rule of law. And so that's what I mean. That when we get sucked into these kind of genius myths and people end up thinking that they're so precious and talented, you lose the excitement that comes from just seeing other cool, smart people do cool, smart things and getting to be a part of it yourself. That's my pitch.
Yeah.
There's an essay I quote in this by Paul Graham, who's one of the founders of Y Combinator. And he says, if you're 20, look at what you're interested in and look at the most interesting place in the world to do that and try and be there. What is the university that has the best course in it? What's the lab that's got the best thing? What's the, what is the most exciting place with other people who are interested in the same thing you are, which you can do when you're young. And I just think that is the way to approach it.
Yeah. Where are the artists that the property developers haven't got to yet?
I know. I'm afraid you're going to have to live in zone 59 and commute in, but yeah.
Yeah, north of Hadrian's Wall, possibly.
Yeah.
Helen Lewis, thank you so much for coming in. I really, really appreciate it. Thank you for talking to me.
Thank you.